Hello, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. This week on Religion and Life, we explore the relationship between intentional communities and their religious foundations. American culture has given us many examples of intentional and utopian communities throughout history, and we have one right here in the High Country in Todd. Here to discuss the Blackburn House are the Reverend Brandon Rencher, Executive Director of the Blackburn House, Ingrid Forsyth, and Mary Claire Gruby, both staff members at the Blackburn House. Welcome to you all, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, man.
Reverend Brandon, if I may?
Sure.
All right, let's start with you.
Okay.
The Blackburn House is self-described as an intentional community.
Absolutely.
And I thought we might just start with you describing what that means. What is an intentional community? What role does it play in the community, and so forth?
Sure. An intentional community, broadly speaking, can be any form of group that comes together for religious, political, social reasons or other reasons to sort of live an alternative lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And usually there's some form of co-housing that takes place. So that may look like the group staying in one house. It may look like the group staying in multiple houses in a neighborhood. And usually the purpose is for painting a picture of a different way to live in the world.
So in this case, I think there's one house, the Blackburn House, and if I'm correct, I believe it was the former parsonage of the Blackburn Chapel.
Absolutely.
And you have 5 or 6 people now living communally in this house, working together towards some common goals to serve the community. Ingrid and Mary Claire are both former students of our program here in Religious Studies, and you're both now part of this community. Could you tell me a little bit about your roles and how you, Brandon mentioned alternative lifestyle. How is life in the Blackburn House alternative, would you say?
Well, I would say it's very alternative. As a former college student, and having lived with roommates and been through that, it's for lack of a better word, a lot more intentional. And the way that we live with each other, we pray together, we eat together, we make time for each other to hang out together. And it's the idea is to live for one another in a sense. And if I would say that if you wanted to draw on New Testament parallels, you might look at the idea of like submitting to one another in Christ. And so that's really, I think, what we're striving for. I like to say that is. My role within the house is I am a first year, and my role is also the communications and community outreach coordinator. So Blackburn House not only functions as an intentional community, but we also function as a community development organization. And our hope is to increase vitality in Todd and to listen to the people's stories of Todd and to, in some way, enhance that community.
So let me make sure I understand you. There's one aspect of living communally that is to support one another in development of spirituality and common goals, it sounds like. But then there's this community development aspect as well.
Yes.
And that's where you work together to reach out to the community beyond your household of 5 people.
Yes.
And I was talking to Ingrid earlier. Maybe you can speak to this. What are some of the ways that you reach out to the community beyond the Blackburn House itself, but into the larger Todd community or even beyond?
Well, a big value of the Blackburn House is sustainability, especially when it comes to food. So we have a community garden, and we give food to different organizations so we can provide fresh produce for people who don't have access to it. And that's the part of our life that's most attractive to me, is the sustainability and creation care. Basically.
Creation care.
Caring for, showing your spirituality through caring for God's creation by not wasting.
And that would spill over beyond agriculture, but into all aspects of life, using energy, for example. Now, you were mentioning earlier that you operate almost as a food co-op, I think. You purchase organic foods and then distribute it to the community. Some people pay more so that others can receive food for free. Could you comment on that program a little bit?
I would say that our current project with that is still a lot under construction. We're in the very early stages, so I hesitate to call it a food co-op just yet. Okay. We are working towards that and hopefully finding ways to bring food to Todd, because the community is very small. There's no grocery store. There's no gas station in the Todd area. The closest one is either Boone or West Jefferson, as well as grocery stores as well. So we're trying to help find different ways to incorporate infrastructure into this tiny community and find ways in which we can support it as a rural community, because rural communities across the United States are suffering a lot. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to find ways in which we can help sustain Todd with different community partners, and the food project is one of the ways in which we do that.
I was going to ask you how you advertise or how people know about you, but I guess in a small rural community, word of mouth is your advertisement, so people know that if they need something, they can come to the Blackburn House.
Word of mouth is definitely the best way to reach people. And Todd, we've found that time and time again.
Yeah, one of the kind of premier programs that we provide through the community development organization is community organizing in different ways, some more formal than others. Mm-hmm. And really it's more than just sort of how we think about community organizing traditionally, which is sort of resisting power. Really it's a communication channel as well, because like you said, you can't, advertising is just different in a rural area. So you do have to go door to door, but you have to do it in a very intentional way, in a very strategic way. So.
And I'd like to hear you say a little more about community organization. Okay. I know one of your interests, or a couple of your interests in particular, is social justice, mm-hmm. Social reconciliation. Mm-hmm. How does that work in a small place like Todd? Yeah. What does the community look like, and what sort of efforts are you working toward to create a more equitable and just society? Yeah,
great question. Well, Todd is unique in that because of some of the broader rural patterns of sort of development, there's several developments that have kind of bubbled up over the last several decades. Mm-hmm. When I say developments, I mean large sort of housing projects that have developed. And they tend to be second home owners or vacation homes for mm-hmm. folks that are from Florida or other parts of the U.S. And so what has happened is it's sort of caused some questions to emerge about who sort of the community belongs to and who's sort of at home, who represents Todd, for example. Right. And so even though those developments have kind of sprung up all over the place, it's also the case that there's still folks around Todd that were born and raised there and have decided to make a life there, even with some of the challenges that come along with living in a rural area. And so, a lot of what we try to do is to sort of create surprising friendships through just kind of hosting events, through community organizing, through kind of being peacemakers in a really kind of mundane, sort of ordinary way, if that makes sense.
Right. So. Well, some of the tensions you described, maybe tensions is a little harsh, but I think we feel that throughout the area. Mm-hmm. There are families who have been here for many generations, mm-hmm. and then there have been in the last decades an influx of second home purchasers, part-time residents, university mm-hmm. faculty members, and students. So it's really kind of a mixture when it comes to population. So I can imagine how that might play out in a small rural place like Todd.
I mean, you got you don't so much have racial diversity in Todd, but you do have definitely socioeconomic, cultural diversity. You have mm-hmm. a sort of I don't know how this happened, but there's sort of a population in Todd that consists of ASU grads from over the years, because Todd is a beautiful place and it's a great place for respite and contemplation, and it's affordable in a sense. Maybe not the vacation homes, right. But and so you just got a lot of kind of it's just very eclectic. It's more eclectic than you'd think. It sort of breaks down the stereotype of sort of rural areas as backwoods and sort of everyone talking on their front porches, if that makes sense.
And that comment brings up something that's on your website. One of the quotes that caught my attention was that you want to, as a community, be inclusive of all stories. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a nice way of saying that you're reaching out to a community and trying to include a diversity of opinion, belief. Could you say a little bit about that? What are some of these stories that you find in Todd? And Ingrid, I know you grew up here. You didn't grow up in Todd, but you grew up in the area. And what are some of the stories that you and Mary Claire can point to in the attempt to be inclusive, for example?
Well, there's a great diversity in Todd, and there are people who've lived there for generations, and there's people who just moved there, so their stories are going to look really different. And our desire is to really reach the people who've been there for generations and to figure out what they want, because we're the newcomers. So that's probably our biggest challenge, is figuring out the best way to develop while taking into account the stories of the people who've lived there for so long.
You say you're the newcomers. Has there ever been an instance when you felt not welcome?
I don't know. Have you, or
I don't, not necessarily unwelcome, though. One of our members of the intentional community, she's from California, and she had mentioned that, I think, to somebody, and they just kind of looked a little surprised, and it's just a little bit like, California, oh, like kind of what are you doing out in Todd kind of expression, like. And so I think it's, for me, not so much because I'm from Asheville originally, so it's not like a great distance, but to you came all the the impression of oh, you came all the way from California to live in Todd, because that's what you did. And so a lot of people are a little surprised, and not necessarily distant because of that, but more so just oh, what are you doing here? Kind of sort of curious, I guess, would be the best word.
I think if I were to say something about the sort of challenges of crossing kind of divides and barriers in Todd, a lot of it does have to do with what Ingrid is saying is, there is a sense in which when you come to a new place like Todd, that does sort of really find a lot of comfort in sort of that sort of old story of the sort of history of rural communities as being sort of familial and just warm and kind of front porchish, if you will.
Sure.
And sort of all of the stories of vitality that has sort of been what has made it what it is, today. Oftentimes when newcomers come in, even myself, the tendency is to want to fix or to change without necessarily listening first or hearing what people care about and value, and finding common ground and just sort of building understanding. So I think a lot of times what happens in Todd is, if there is any tension, for example,
Sure.
not saying there necessarily is, it's because of just the lack of opportunities to be able to listen to folks, both newcomers and old timers, if you will, in Todd. And so that's something that we are really sensitive to when we come, and we try to just kind of listen to folks. It sounds really simple, but it has profound meaning for a community that, could easily be one that is neglected and looked over because of the sort of patterns of displacement even.
Right. And you as a group are really providing opportunities for that listening to take place. I think you're active in the community, you have sponsored programs, and I think that's really quite impressive. And what I know about Todd anyway is it's a pretty active community, so a lot of opportunities to gather for music and for picnics, I think.
Exactly.
So it's really, really nice. I like the way you put that you're providing opportunities to listen, and you're attempting to listen.
Yeah.
One of the things that you really have a well-established mission and vision statement on your website, and I would invite our listeners and our viewers to visit the website and read about what it is you're trying to accomplish and how you situate yourself among intentional communities. One of the things that caught my attention is that, at least in the house, you're attempting to deal with people holistically, and you're attempting to develop yourselves holistically. And I take that to mean spiritually, physically, psychologically, and every other dimension of the human experience. Could you maybe comment on that a little bit? How do you deal with, how do you work to develop yourselves and then others from a holistic perspective?
Well, I think our church definitely does that in the way that we teach and the way that we welcome and the messages that we give. So we really honor the integrity of the human being and the human mind, and we support people, and we're really there for them. And we have different people come and speak, but our sermons the message on Sunday is usually one of inclusion and one of inviting.
Mm-hmm.
So our goal is to create this really safe place for Christians and even non-Christians, which was extremely healing for me as a college student when I first started going to Blackburn, which is what led me to become a part of the community, to live there now.
So the church you mentioned is Blackburn Chapel,
right?
Which is associated with the house, is that
right?
And are you minister?
I am
at the chapel.
pastor.
Okay, so when you say the sermons you hear, we're talking about this man right here.
Well,
Some of them.
Some of them,
Okay.
yeah, a lot of them.
All right. So there is this spiritual dimension connected to the church, and of course you've mentioned the well-being and health, your outreach with the food programs and whatnot. So that's part of what it means to be holistically oriented. It's not just the spiritual dimension,
Exactly.
but you're reaching out to people.
And another piece too is something that I try to remind myself of and the staff of and residents of the community is that even as we are seeking to be creative and sort of support existing initiatives and programs and projects in Todd and start new ones, it's important that we pay attention to people's embodied presence in Todd. And so what that looks like oftentimes is in a rural community, it's kind of like small rural churches. You depend on a few people that kind of do everything, and the goal is always to sort of get more people involved. It's always a constant struggle in rural areas, especially in particular. And so paying attention to people's, if they're feeling drained, or if they're tired. So caring is really important to what we do. And so part of what's really awesome about having an intentional community as part of the collaborative work that we do in the community is that it guards against some of the institutionalization that would be more concerned about deadlines and projects and measures and outcomes, and it's more concerned about people. And so if someone is burnt out or that is really central to the community, especially if they're an old timer, we might have to press pause on something or go a little bit slower, because it's important to care for that person and allow ourselves to be cared for too, because it's hard work and a hard life in many ways. So.
Sure.
And I would add that we resist institutionalization and we also resist consumerism, and that's a big part of our life.
Well, that's an interesting comment, because I was talking earlier to all of you about whether or not you sense a connection with a long line of intentional communities and utopian communities in American culture, and you hesitated a little bit because I don't think there's a purposeful connection, but there are some commonalities: the resistance to institutionalization, the application of sustainability and sustainable practices, the importance of small communities within rural areas. These are all kind of characteristics of those movements. So I think I would, as a student of these movements, I would situate you well within that history of intentionality among communities. But Mary Claire had mentioned something too, and said that you really kind of sense yourself as being a part of the quote-unquote new monastic community. And if you could comment obviously you don't have a monastery out there in Todd, but maybe you could comment just briefly on what that means.
So the new monastic movement is a movement among Christians to really get back to this idea of living intentionally for one another. And there's several new monastic movements across the United States. Actually, I found out recently that we have about 22 in North Carolina, which I thought was a rather large number for our small state. We have one at Durham, led by I guess you would call him a theologian, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove.
I think he's a theologian. An organic theologian.
An organic theologian. So we, in terms of the new monastic movement, it's really kind of sprung up as a way to be real as a Christian in more ways. Not to say that like living life in living life in a church or doing a church plant isn't real, but it's kind of getting back to the heart of what's in the New Testament and the church in Acts. So I think that's really what we're trying to strive for, at least with the new monastic movement. And certainly Blackburn House comes out of that.
And they tend to be, made up of sort of millennial generation folks, not exclusively.
Right here. Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not exclusively. I mean, there are communities that we have friendships with, for example, such as Reba Place Fellowship in Illinois, as one example that is a sort of the grandparent, if you will, of the new monastic community that is sort of more, older folks that are part of that community. But I do think we're connected to that tradition, and in many ways it's seeking to be not so much better than the church, but to be faithful to what the church's best ideals are, and to provide some sense of reform to what the church can be. So.
Yeah, and I hear elements here of something that scholars call primitivism, and that means getting back to the way the church was in the beginning.
Absolutely.
Getting behind the institutional structures, getting back to the New Testament church, I think was the phrase that you used, Mary Claire. And it sounds like another word I've heard you all say is reflection. So this provides a kind of emphasis on spiritual and internal reflection, personal reflection, if you will, which touches on the monastic theme,
Absolutely.
I think. So I know you don't want to think institutionally, so I hesitate. I'm not going to ask you about a 5-year plan.
Okay.
All right. But where do you see this going? I mean, 5 years from now, you still going to be. There's always the temptation, I think, to grow, right? So, what's the future of this? How do you resist the temptation to grow, and how do you maintain this kind of focus on smallness, if you will, and intentionality, and resist the tug that institutions tend to exert? Because I'm sure you feel that probably. You're connected to the Methodist Church in some ways. You're connected to Duke University.
Absolutely.
So how do you maintain a healthy relationship there, but resist the temptation to bring in those elements of institutionalization?
I think one of our values, which is community process, or what we might call cooperation, is a big part of it. So, if we're truly committed to that, folks that aren't necessarily so yoked to any institution that we're connected to will raise their voices in ways that remind us that it is about being sort of authentic and small and true to what we're sort of really after. And to the extent that an institution leads us in a different direction, our hope is that the community will speak, but also that we'll be true to what we claim, which is that we are trying to resist institutionalization. So not just sort of a response from the community, but that we'll be faithful to. I'd also say 3 things. So, 4 things. John Wesley, speaking of Methodism, has what's called his 3 simple rules: do no harm, do good, stay in love with God. They're part of what's called our rule of life. And there's a quote in a pretty popular intentional community book within Methodism now called Longing for Spring. And there's one community that has said, I don't know what the future holds. We'll be faithful today. We'll be faithful this week, and we leave the rest up to God, or we leave the rest up to what comes of this sort of lifestyle that we're trying to live. So I think that focus on today. I mean, there's enough to worry about, especially the kind of work that we're doing in community. We're not living individualistically, so it's full of material and things to focus on that help keep us not distracted on sort of building empires and institutions for the future.
And that's my hope. In terms of institutionalism, we live in Todd. It's not a big, sprawling metropolis. We're not really, we're not focused on growing in numbers. We're more focused on growing with each other than anything. And that's really, we're focused on the community. And people who decide to live in Todd, you've got to be a certain kind of person, I would say. So
there's a real libertarian kind of spirit in Todd. Right. It's unincorporated, so and that's why I say we really depend on the community in many ways. So
in some ways, my question might have been out of bounds just a little bit to ask you to project 5 years out, and your response is there's enough to worry about today without worry. That reminds me of something Jesus said, I think.
That's right.
That's right. Keeping that focus on present problems, that's part of the whole experience. experience.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to ask one more question, I think, before we run out of time. You mentioned earlier these beautiful windows in your church. Could you just tell me a little bit about the stained glass in your church?
Yeah, an artist she runs the Elkland Art Center, which is an incredible nonprofit organization in Todd that we work very closely with. So Martha Insman, the director of Elkland Art Center, is a member of our church, and she designed these gorgeous windows, and there's 8 windows, and each one is a different wildflower of the high country. And on one side of the church she has spring flowers, and then they move to summer flowers. On the other side of the church there's autumn flowers, and then there's dead thickets of winter. And so the evolution of the flowers with the seasons of the year is supposed to represent Christ's life.
And what strikes me about that, and we'll end on this, is that what you've done with the windows there, I think, is symbolic of what you're doing with the community. Rather than having the traditional Christian symbols and crosses and whatnot, you've taken what's characteristic of the community and used it then to express your own philosophical outreach.
We're very close to nature. That's a big part of our life. So that's what I love about the windows.
Back to the transcendentalist too.
Yeah.
Well, this has been very interesting. I love the idea of what you're doing. I'd like to visit you sometime if it's okay.
Absolutely.
Please.
Come out to Todd. It's a beautiful area. So thank you for coming today and informing us about the Blackburn House.
Well, thank
so
you.
much for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Well, that's Religion and Life for this week. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.